The rain came down without mercy, heavy and relentless, turning the narrow dirt road into a river of mud and the open field into a trembling mirror of grey sky, and she stood there in the middle of it all, her thin shawl soaked through, clinging to her shoulders like a second skin, her feet numb from the cold earth beneath her, while her two cows huddled beside her with lowered heads, their bodies shivering, their hides slick with rain, their eyes wide with a quiet confusion they could not voice. She had no shelter for them anymore. The small shed she had built with borrowed bamboo, torn plastic, and rusted sheets had collapsed just hours earlier under the weight of the storm. And when it fell, it felt as if the last fragile wall between her and complete ruin had fallen with it. She did not cry. Crying required energy, and energy was something her life had long ago taught her to ration. Instead, she stood firm, one hand resting on the neck of the older cow, whispering soft words meant to calm both the animal and herself, promising that the rain would pass, that things would somehow be all right, even though she had no proof left to believe it. She was known in the village simply as the woman, a widow whose name no one used anymore, living at the edge of everything, the edge of land ownership, the edge of community, the edge of hope. Her husband had died years ago in an accident that paid no compensation and earned no sympathy, beyond a few days of murmured condolences. Since then, her life had narrowed into survival, working other people's fields, selling small quantities of milk, skipping meals so the cows could eat, enduring stares that carried judgment without words. The cows were not just animals. They were her dignity, her livelihood, the last proof that she was still standing on her own feet. And now, in this storm, she could protect them from nothing. As the rain intensified, a pickup truck slowed on the road nearby. Inside sat a rancher, a man whose land stretched wide and green beyond the village, whose barns had strong roofs and whose cattle never feared storms. He had driven this road countless times and rarely noticed anything beyond his schedule. But this time something made him stop. Perhaps it was the way the woman stood unmoving in the downpour, placing herself slightly in front of the animals as if her body could shield them. Perhaps it was the sight of resilience standing alone where help should have been. He stepped out into the rain, ignoring the discomfort, and walked toward her. She noticed him only when he was close. Instinctively, she lowered her eyes. Being seen like this, exposed, helpless, carried a familiar sting of shame. She expected a question that led nowhere or advice that cost nothing. Instead, he asked simply why the cows were standing uncovered. She answered honestly, her voice calm, explaining the collapse, the storm, the lack of options. She did not ask for help. She had learned that asking often deepened the wound. The rancher listened, truly listened. And then he looked at her for a long moment, not with pity but with recognition. Finally, he spoke the words that would quietly alter the course of her life. "Come with me." She stared at him, unsure she had heard correctly over the sound of the rain. He explained that she and her cattle could stay at his ranch until she found her footing again. Not as charity, he said, but as work. There would be shelter, feed, and a chance to earn with dignity. She hesitated, pride wrestling with desperation, fear wrestling with hope. But when another gust of wind sent the cows shifting uneasily, she nodded. The ranch was unlike anything she had known. The barns were warm and dry, the animals well cared for, the routines structured yet fair. She worked hard, harder than anyone expected, rising before dawn, learning new skills, treating every task with respect. The rancher watched quietly as weeks turned into months, noting her discipline, her honesty, the way she cared for animals as if they were extensions of herself. Slowly, her posture changed. The constant tension in her shoulders eased. She began to speak more, to smile occasionally, to believe again. When the rainy season ended, the rancher did something unexpected. He offered her a small piece of land near the ranch, not as a gift, but as a partnership. With savings from her work and support she never abused, she built a proper shelter for her cattle, stronger than the one she had lost. A structure that stood firm against the weather. The day she led her cows into their new shed, sunlight filtering through clean wooden beams. She allowed herself to cry for the first time in years, not from sorrow, but from relief. She returned to the village not as the woman, but as someone restored. People noticed. They always do when strength replaces struggle. And though her life was still simple, it was no longer fragile. Stories like this are not loud. They do not shout miracles or promise instant change. They remind us that sometimes a single moment of kindness, a single sentence spoken without arrogance, can become a turning point for an entire life. And if you find yourself drawn to stories that honor quiet resilience and the power of human compassion, then staying connected to such journeys matters. Because the world changes not only through grand gestures, but through stories that teach us to look again and act when it counts. And somewhere, whenever rain begins to fall, a woman no longer fears the sky.